I'm Kevin Murphy. I work with Lars at the BFI. He's really the guy in charge. I kind of help out where I can. I'm here to organize. Doug asked me if I would organize or be the moderator for this first panel. I think it's part of a broader project we have at the BFI of looking at the legacy of Chicago economics. And one of the biggest challenges we've had in trying to fulfill that role is trying to come to a coherent definition of what is Chicago economics. And I think we're counting on today's discussions and the scholars who are here today to give us some insight into that and help us really, to the extent possible, really come to an understanding of what the long and really great history of Chicago economics is. We're going to start in the 30s today and then was this morning, and then move through time essentially and in the day with a discussion from some people who are still, fortunately, still with us and able to discuss their personal experiences here at Chicago. Unfortunately, Frank Knight and Viner and Simons couldn't make it today. They're no longer with us, although I heard Frank Knight still votes in the economics department every once in a while when a particularly contentious vote comes up, his name is sometimes called on, but I don't think he's voting today. Today we're going to have Ross Emmett here to talk about Knight, Daniel Hammond to talk about Viner, and Doug Irwin to talk about Simon. So I think it would be a really great first panel. I hope I can learn a lot that will help me better understand the legacy of how we got to where we are today, and from my own point of view, how we got to what we now think of as Chicago price theory, which is, of course, only a small part of the overall Chicago story, but a part that's near and dear to my heart as kind of a distant relative who's inherited this. I feel like, somebody's going to Ancestry.com and trying to find his distant relatives, knowing that, the great success they had in the past. Well, hopefully we'll learn more and give us some guidance as we put together the Chicago history as part of the BFI project. So our first speaker would be Ross Emmett, and as I said, he's going to talk about Frank Knight.
Good morning, and I want to say how happy I am to be here today. I'd like to thank the Becker Friedman Institute for putting on this event, and Doug Irwin for the organizational effort to get us together. For those of us presenting today, it's a bit of a old homecoming week. Many of us know each other quite well, and it's fun to have the chance to be together to discuss what we often discuss, but in this setting it will be a lot of fun. Frank Knight's first appointment at the University of Chicago began in 1917. He replaced Jacob Viner as an instructor in the Department of Political Economy, and he taught, and Lars, you might want to pay attention to this, he taught statistics and economics. Viner returned the favor 2 years later, coming back to Chicago as Knight left for a position at the University of Iowa. During his first years here, Knight worked with John Maurice Clark, who was the only economic theorist in the department at the time, to complete the revisions for his Cornell University doctoral dissertation. The dissertation was published in 1921, bearing the now famous title, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. In the mid-1920s, the Chicago department changed names from the Department of Political Economy to the Department of Economics, and it revised its curriculum. By 1930, the core of the curriculum was a sequence of courses in price theory, history of economic thought, and money and banking. I might say that this was a very unusual decision to have price theory at the core of the graduate program in economics in the 1930s. Most other universities did not require students to take price theory or economic theory or micro and macro at that point in time. The world has changed, largely here because of Chicago at this particular case. Viner was the professor of price theory. Lloyd Mintz was the primary professor for the money and banking sequence. Following on the heels of his 1927 translation of Max Weber's General Economic History, Knight rejoined the economics department in 1928 to assume responsibility for the sequence in the history of economic thought. Intriguingly, he was also hired to teach courses on institutionalism. By 1930, Knight was also teaching price theory. Against the backdrop of his newly acquired Weberian perspective, the teaching of the history of economic thought and his teaching of price theory led him to completely rethink his approach to economic theory between 1930 and 1935. These changes that he made can be seen in a number of different places. In the note that's attached at the end of Chapter 2 of the Economic Organization, the press would not allow him to insert more pages. They restricted him to the amount of space available at the last page of the chapter. And so he wrote different versions of this criticism of his own thinking, and he was limited to a very small amount of space. And so he basically says, everything you just read in this chapter is wrong. And here's why it's wrong. But he didn't get much chance to sort of say what he thought was wrong about it. He did, however, then turn and write many articles about that. For example, in the articles Statics and Dynamics and the Ricardian Theory of Production and Distribution, which were both included in the collection of his essays that his students presented him on his 50th birthday, called The Ethics of Competition. In an expanded set of notes called Notes on Utility and Cost, which were published in German in 1935 and never published in English. The English version circulated among students at Chicago as a pamphlet to accompany the Economic Organization, which was also circulated as a pamphlet here at Chicago. And eventually, when the Economic Organization was published in 1951, the notes on utility and cost were included with that, although the publisher, in their haste to publish it, switched the words. So the English version in 1951 published has notes on cost and utility. The actual order is notes on utility and cost. And then finally, of course, in the long string of articles in the 1930s that comprise Knight's criticism and controversy with the Austrian economists over capital theory. So part of what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the 1930s, especially the first half of the 1930s, would have been an engaging time to be a student at Chicago, while Knight was teaching and rethinking his understanding of price theory from utility theory to cost theory to capital theory right in front of your eyes. Fortunately, there was a group of students and colleagues here to appreciate what they were witnessing. Some of this group continued their conversations with Knight outside of class, in his office, at the Quadrangle Club, and at his home. Henry Simons, Milton Friedman, George Stiegler, Aaron Director and his sister Rose Director, of course you know her as Rose Director Friedman, Alan Wallace, Homer Jones. He may be one of the ones you don't recognize. Homer Jones went on to work at the St. Louis Fed, was an early monetarist, and became part of the founding shadow open market committee members. Alice Hansen, who married Homer Jones and is a noted economic historian of colonial America, and Lloyd Mintz. All of these, and probably others as well, regularly joined the Knights for dinner and conversation on Sunday evenings. The Knights' home is now a parking lot behind the Harris School, so the home is not intact, but that's where they met. Another person who sometimes met with them was Albert Hart, who was a participant in the formation of the Chicago Plan for banking reform. After the mid-1930s, Knight published only a handful of articles in economic theory. His attention turned to a broader intellectual project that brought him into economics in the first place. That broader project was focused on the role of social scientific inquiry in the defense of a free society. George Stiegler once described Knight's project this way: for most present-day economists, The primary purpose is to increase our knowledge of the working of the enterprise and other economic systems. For Knight, the primary role of economic theory is rather different. It is to contribute to the understanding of how, by consensus based on rational discussion, we can fashion a liberal society in which individual freedom is preserved and a satisfactory economic performance achieved. In Knight's estimation, economics played a limited but important role in that project. The most important task of the economist was to assist society in understanding the essential core of price theory. Equally important would be a comparative analysis of political and social institutions and decisions and discussion regarding social ethics and social justice. Knight's own comparative institutional analysis appeared in 1935 in an essay entitled Economic Theory and Nationalism, which is the final essay in the book, The Ethics of Competition. And his evaluation of competing ethical systems appears in a three-part article. It appears many places, but it appears most concisely at this point in time in a three-part article entitled Ethics and Economic Reform, which surveys his criticisms of basically every ethical system. In the 1930s, Knight feared that liberalism was sick and needed resuscitation. The appeal that Americans in the early 30s had found in the European emergence of collectivism, both fascist and communist, made Knight despair for the future of freedom. Indeed, on the eve of the 1932 election, he delivered an address here at the university entitled "The Case for Communism from the Standpoint of an Ex-Liberal." The point was not to encourage us to become communist, but that liberalism was so sick that we needed to rethink how our society was founded. For the subsequent 10 years, Knight railed against collectivism in almost every venue possible. Following the end of World War II, he continued his pursuit of a general defense of a free society. He retired in 1952 and was retained for the remainder of his life as a professor of philosophy and the social sciences, associated both with the economics department and the Committee on Social Thought, which is a separate story, but he helped to found the committee. My brief overview of Knight's career suggests that his legacy for the Chicago School is mixed. What I want to do in the last few minutes is consider two aspects of that mixed legacy. The first regards his relationship to the Chicago School. By my reckoning, the Chicago School was not founded in the 1930s. True, the teaching of price theory and the history of economic thought by Viner and Knight laid the foundations for what was to come around 1950. And Viner's approach to price theory, as Friedman tells us, left no doubt that economics really had something to say about real problems. That's a comment that might not be said about Knight's Crusonia plant, but would describe well Simon's course in the law school. But post-war Chicago economics reflected an empirical and empirically grounded methodological approach that was lacking in the 1930s, and the development of the workshop system entrenched this new approach for students and faculty. Nevertheless, it is fair to say that the post-war Chicago School emerged from the circle of students and colleagues who gathered around Frank Knight in the early 1930s, and who I have called the Knight Circle. I've extracted 3 of that circle for this slide. Of particular importance to the school's formation at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s were 3 of the people who were in the the Knight Circle in the 30s: Friedman, Wallace, and Director. The date 1946 matters. Friedman returned to Chicago as a professor in 1946, assuming Jacob Viner's mantle teaching price theory, and also assuming Lloyd Mint's mantle teaching money and banking. Alan Wallace was appointed at the university, also in 1946, as professor of statistics and economics. Eventually, he chaired the Department of Statistics and then became dean of the university's Graduate School of Business from 1956 to 1962, which were formative years for the adoption of the Chicago approach in the Graduate School of Business. Alan Director taught courses for the economics department during the 30s and 40s, and was appointed to the law school following the death of Henry Simons in 1946. The growth of Chicago law and economics followed from director's appointment. Thus, we could say, from the Knight Circle was the Chicago School born, reaching across economics, the business school, and the law school, basically from its beginnings in the late 40s. But perhaps the most important person in the institutionalization of the Chicago School, not its conceptions, but its institutionalization, was not a member of the Knight Circle, although he deeply admired Knight's work, and that's T.W. Schultz. Schultz arrived at the university in the mid-40s and assumed the role of chair of the department soon after, in fact, in 1946. It was Schultz's administrative acumen which soon provided a unified structure to the school's educational and research activities, in tandem with Friedman, Greg Lewis, D. Gale Johnson. Schultz set in motion the workshop system that became the school's hallmark by the 1960s. The other topic I was going to say a few words about is price theory. Here we have very much a mixed legacy. Between the late 1920s and the 1990s, the teaching of price theory at Chicago was primarily entrusted to 5 masters: Viner, Knight, Friedman, Harburger, and Gary Becker. Kevin, you're up next. Yeah. Knight's place among the Chicago masters is secure for several reasons. He laid the foundation for Chicago's approach to price theory with his demonstration in the economic organization of the way in which prices simultaneously coordinate the activities of buyers and sellers across markets to fulfill, without centralized control, the social functions that every economy is called to perform. The point was illustrated by his wheel of wealth, which is actually a circular flow diagram. You're going to see it in a minute, which Paul Samuelson adopted. Paul Samuelson was a student here, and he was in the same cohort with Friedman and the like, which Samuelson used for macroeconomic use, which is the more common use today. But Knight's Weberian methodology led him to emphasize the relevance of basic economic principles to real-world analysis while denying the necessity of providing theory with realistic assumptions. That's an argument that Friedman picked up, albeit with a different kind of methodological base. Not a Weberian base, but an instrumentalist, probably, base. Knight unified utility and cost theory in the notion of opportunity cost and eliminated the differences among the ultimate factors of production by focusing the theorist's attention on marginal cost analysis in an equilibrium context. All of these are aspects of the analysis that Chicago eventually adopted. His choice of capital as the name for the single factor of production, as well as his arguments that consumption and production are simultaneous events. There's no waiting time, he says, between the production of a stream of services and their consumption, enabled Chicago to sidestep the morass of capital theory controversy that economists at the 2 Cambridges, the one in England and the one in Massachusetts, sunk into in the 1960s, and also set the stage for the development of human capital theory by Schultz and Becker. And yet, post-war Chicago price theory was decidedly Marshallian, while Knight's price theory was closer to the Austrians. While Knight was busy in the early 40s helping to create the Committee on Social Thought, an alternative within the university to the increased specialization of knowledge in departments, his students were narrowing the focus of economics as a social science in ways that lent them a focus that was different than Knight's. Unlike their mentor, who saw economics as part of a broader approach to intelligent social action that required both a theory of politics and a theory of ethics, the only problem for Knight was that he could never find a theory of ethics that satisfied him. His students were reshaping economics into an applied policy science. Reshaping economics required the members of the Chicago School to systematically overturn the assumptions that Knight used to undergird his understanding of the relationship of price theory to the defense of a free society. On the methodological front, Friedman made predictive power the measure of theory's success. Confronting theory with evidence became the focus of a Chicago economist research, and the excitement of empirical studies, from development to public finance and monetary policy to regulatory rules, replaced the excitement Knight had evoked for theoretical analysis. And then Stiegler and Becker brushed aside Knight's concerns about changing values and not only changing, but conflicting values and tastes by assuring Chicago economists that it was always acceptable to look first at changes in cost structures before resorting to the argument that tastes or values have changed. When the methodology of positive economics, the Friedman essay, and De Gustibus non est disputandum, the Stiegler-Becker article, were combined with the empirical techniques developed by Chicago's econometricians, an applied policy science emerged that I have argued was, in effect, a rejection of Knight's vision for social science. So what I've tried to do for you here this morning to start off is to suggest that while Knight set the stage for the Chicago school to emerge, his vision of what social science was is different than what has emerged, and can be criticized by present economists and can also be thought about in conversation with them. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everybody who had a hand in putting this session up. My topic is Jacob Viner and price theory. And we've heard something from Ross about the differences in Frank Knight's idea of price theory and the use of economic theory, and Viner's, and especially the post-war generation of Chicago economists. People do indeed associate Chicago economics with price theory, with applied policy science, with a down-to-earth, low-tech, Marshallian partial equilibrium approach to economic analysis, which students learn from Viner. In 1946, in the summer of 1946, after sharing an office together at the University of Minnesota, George Stiegler and Milton Friedman went their separate ways. Friedman came here to take over teaching price theory for Viner, and Stiegler went to Brown University. And Friedman, in writing his lectures, was using both Alfred Marshall's principles and Stiegler's brand new 1946, The Theory of Price. There's a lively conversation between them, and in letters, in correspondence, and in one of the letters in August 46, Stiegler refers to Friedman and his idea of what good economic theory is. He says, this is Stiegler writing to Friedman, "I shall conjecture, if only to hasten the enlightenment, that you, like a firm skeleton of rigorous theory, well skinned with concrete illustrations, in the manner of Marshall and Burns, all oriented in accordance with your general view of how economic life runs. In any case, I do." And the Burns here, of course, is Arthur F. Burns, who is one of the people in the background who I think had a very important role in shaping post-war Chicago economics, even though he wasn't here. In 1988, I interviewed Milton Friedman, and I asked him about the centrality of price theory in the graduate program at Chicago. And here on this slide, we have his response. He said, "There's no doubt that Chicago was distinctive and has been ever since. The real distinction was not making price theory the focal point of the graduate curriculum. That isn't the real distinction at all. The fundamental distinction is treating economics as a serious subject versus treating it as a branch of mathematics, and treating it as a scientific subject as opposed to an aesthetic subject, if I might put it that way." The second slide here is, so Friedman was referring to what he learned from Viner and others at Chicago when he made this comment. And the second slide here is just for, if you don't know much about Jacob Viner, a very brief biography. He was born in Montreal in 1892, his undergraduate degree at McGill, Harvard, and PhD in 1922. As you can see, he had been at Chicago for a while when he finished his PhD. And as Ross mentioned, he left for Princeton in 1946, retired in 1960, and passed away in 1970. Here are two pictures of Weiners. The one on the left, both are undated and are not identified in the photographic archive, but I'm guessing since we're in the middle of being Big Ten country, I'm guessing that on the left, Weiners watching the Maroon, who were a Big Ten football power in the 1920s and 30s. And then this picture on the right with Theodore Schultz, T.W. Schultz, is a return visit to Chicago after Weiner, sometime not too long after Weiner had gone to Princeton. And here we have Doug Irwin's and Steve Medema's edition of Jacob Weiner's price theory notes, Marshall Ketchum. These are, I think, 1939, the notes were taken. Weiner taught 3 courses. He taught price theory 301. He taught international finance and trade 370, and he taught modern tendencies in economics, econ 303. Modern tendencies was, as I see it, a companion course for price theory. Price theory was mostly the analytics. Modern tendencies was Weiner's commentary on the price theory that the students studied in 301. And then we have down at the bottom here the citation of Weiner for his Francis Walker Medal in 1962, and I want to call your attention to this especially because this is partly my theme. He represents the greatest combination of theoretical keenness with no need for fancy techniques, alertness to policy issues, and historical scholarship in both economic institutions and economic ideas. In all fields to which he has contributed, including his specialty, international economics, his name will survive brightly as a deflator of pretentious nonsense as well as an original creator. So, what did Weiner's students learn from him? It's obvious. What we all know is that they learned price theory and international trade and finance. But I think they learned something else that was very important, that was a key component of the pre-war and the post-war Chicago school. And this is that they should be scholars. And as I understand it, to be a scholar for Jacob Weiner meant they should take ideas seriously, and you can see this in Friedman's comment to me in my interview that I had up, that they should take history seriously, and that they should be humble about what they know and how much they know. Now, this third point may seem a little odd if you've heard stories about Weiner's demeanor in the classroom. He did not like to be corrected, or if you've heard stories or known George Stigler, we usually don't think of George Stigler as a humble man. Friedman may be more so, but Friedman was very pugnacious in arguments. But I really think that Weiner's students, including his 2 most famous students, Friedman and Stigler, learned something about scholarship in Weiner's way of viewing scholarship and being a scholar. The next slide, along the same theme, is from Weiner's 1950 Brown University graduate convocation address. I'll just read the beginning of this and the end. My proposal is both sincere and modest. I give also only an old-fashioned and modest meaning to the term scholarship. I mean by it nothing more than the pursuit of broad and exact knowledge of the history of the working of the human mind, as revealed in written records. Scholarship is a commitment to the pursuit of knowledge and understanding, but it can never provide guarantees that these have been attained. A great part of true learning, in fact, takes the form of negative knowledge, of increasing awareness of the range and depth of our unconquered ignorance, Learned ignorance, therefore, is often praiseworthy, although ignorant learning, about which I will say something later, never is. The next slide is a list of the courses that Friedman and Stigler took from Viner. They both took 301, 370, and 303. The S in the 1930s was the grade satisfactory. In 1935-36, they changed to what is now the conventional grades of A's and B's. And you can see that Viner took or registered for 301, Stigler registered for 301 twice. The R beside the second entry there means he was registered but did not turn in any work for evaluation. And this was an option then. You could take courses for a grade, and you could take courses just as a registered student. You didn't have to register for a grade. I would presume that Stigler retook 301 because he was looking to develop his work in price theory, not because he had difficulty with it. I suspect he found it so interesting he wanted to see it again. Not that I need a brush up, but we won't know for sure. This slide and the next slide have the first 4 note cards from Milton Friedman's notes when he took Viner's course in the fall quarter 1932. That card on the left, which may be a little difficult to read, Viner says, according to Friedman, the purpose of the course is to develop neoclassical economics. The meaning of neoclassical economics is economics later than classical economics, but sympathetic in development out of the classicals. This includes, therefore, Marshall, Edgeworth, Pigou, also Jevons, the mathematical school, and the Austrians. It tends to be deductive, static in its analysis, tends to take value and value problems as the center of theory, with little emphasis on consumption and production. And then after the introductory remarks, we have Friedman's list of assigned readings for the course with some commentary about the readings. And then here in this slide, we have in Friedman's hand the reading assignments for 301 on the left, and then the list typed up on the right, and my guess is that this was Friedman's typing because I found them in Friedman's papers with his other course notes. Now, to get to the continuity of Chicago price theory from maybe Knight, but mostly Viner, into Friedman and Stigler and the later generations, here we have the reading list from Friedman's first class that he taught in price theory. He taught in 1939, 1940, when he was working full-time at the National Bureau. He taught an evening course at Columbia on the structure of neoclassical economics. And this list from Columbia is almost identical to his reading list from his 301 course when he returned to Chicago in 1946. Some common readings from Viner, this course, and Friedman's price theory course in 1946 are chapters, other selections from Marshall's Principles, Henry Schultz, The Meaning of Statistical Demand Curves, Viner's Cost Curves and Supply Curves, selections from J.S. Mill's Principles of Political Economy, selections from The Wealth of Nations, from J.B. Clark's The Distribution of Wealth. Here, just as a curiosity, are the 2 first pages of Friedman's notes from Econ 370, International Trade and Finance, and Econ 303, Modern Tendencies. And Modern Tendencies began with John Stuart Mill. Here we have Viner's 303 exams, Modern Tendencies exams, when Friedman took the course in spring 1933. The first question on the first exam over there is, what was J.S. Mill's position with respect to the scope for induction in the social sciences, the use of the geometric method in political economy in the social sciences, and what was J.S. Mill's position with respect to the economic man. Second question in that first exam, explain and appraise Marshall's technique of maximal satisfaction analysis. And then the second exam, number 2, I'll just point out, list all of the empirical, historical laws of economics which have been allegedly discovered by quantitative methods, and indicate for each very briefly whether you are inclined to accept it as a law, and if so, on what grounds. And you're going to hear more shortly from Jennifer and David about Stigler and Friedman's time at Chicago in the 1930s. Here's a bit of commentary from Weiner's 303 course, Modern Tendencies. He's talking about Lionel Robbins' definition of economics. Economics is the relationship between ends and scarce means with alternative uses. And according to Friedman's notes, Weiner thinks that if you change this to studying economizing of means to obtain ends where they have a market phase, this would be more suitable. Weiner says it's important to distinguish between technology and economics, and he asks about the law of diminishing returns. Weiner says this is a purely technological relationship, technological law, but it's part of economics because it was discovered by economists. And then Weiner gives his preferred definition of economics. It's a social study, which is the study of, and I think the word in the notes here is mass social phenomena. Weiner doesn't think it would apply to individual men, Robinson Crusoe. Robbins thinks economics does apply. So I guess here in this definition, Weiner would be ruling out the rational choice approach that developed later at Chicago. This same summer, 1946, when Friedman was preparing to teach price theory and was corresponding with Stigler, they had a disagreement about the law of diminishing returns. As I mentioned, Friedman was using Stigler's theory of price and Marshall, and he wrote to Stigler saying that I think Stigler in his textbook doesn't treat Marshall fairly, and I think Marshall has the better explanation of the theory of the law of diminishing returns, which Friedman suggested is an economic law, not a technological law. And this quotation down on the bottom there, Stigler says, "My dear collaborator, you say that economic empirical evidence is intellectually far more satisfying than technological evidence. I cannot claim even an intuitive understanding of this statement. Diminishing returns is technological, so you prefer an indirect proof to a direct proof." And then he goes on to draw several inferences about Friedman's approach to the law of diminishing returns, all of which make Friedman look like a formalist rather than a good Marshallian price theorist. Here's a bit more commentary from Weiner's Economics 303 on classical economics and its critics. Very few of the critics of classical theory understand it. They aren't interested in it since they think it's no good, but they often are prejudiced before they've learned the classical tradition. And Weiner thought there was no sharp break between classical and neoclassical economics. He says, "My general impression of most economists of today the general impression that most economists of today have about economics of the 19th century is based largely on a general treatise of some sort. The characteristic of a treatise is that it generalizes more rapidly and makes fewer qualifications. People should read the other writings of the classical economist. And then on laissez-faire in classical economics. Not so easy to find an example of leading writers of the 19th century of this doctrine stated universally. You have to go to the continental liberals, who were rather reactionary, to get a bold statement of laissez-faire. The doctrine of complete natural harmony is not the doctrine of any leading economist in the classical tradition, not even Smith. The dominant attitude of major writers toward laissez-faire is not of natural harmony, but that bad as laissez-faire may be, government interference would be still worse. And then on the institutionalist, Viner was critical of Walton Hamilton. He says, as you're going to hear more about Hamilton, I suspect, from Malcolm Rutherford. Hamilton thought value theory was economic theory, and Viner says this is partly an historical accident. Another reason is that value theory has more survival value than other approaches. Also, value problems are more pervasive. So now I return to my theme that I'm trying to briefly develop some way that students learn from Jacob Viner that they should be scholars, and this involves taking ideas seriously, taking history seriously, and being humble about how much they know and what they know. And again, to Friedman's statement to be in the interview, there's no doubt that Chicago economics was distinctive and has been ever since, but it's not because of price theory. It's because economics was treated as a serious subject rather than as a branch of mathematics or an aesthetic subject. And then my last comment is just to make a suggestion that this attitude about scholarship, I believe, is something that you can see carried over certainly into the second generation, the post-war generation of Chicago economists, people like Schultz and Friedman and Stigler. If you think about some of the developments in the late 40s and 1950s at Chicago, there was a continued application of partial equilibrium, Marshallian price theory to policy questions without thinking that you needed to use the latest development in mathematical economics or in econometrics. Taking a critical look at conventional wisdoms such as the idea that the American industry tended to be monopolized quite naturally, and that regulation of industry served the public interest rather than the interest of those who were regulated. The conventional wisdom that the Federal Reserve did everything it could to prevent the Great Depression, or that Keynesian economics had made both the business cycle and the quantity theory of money obsolete. So in summary, I'll just say that I think Jacob Viner left enduring marks on Chicago economics that we see in a deeper and broader way of approaching the study of economic problems than the simple application of technique to economic theory. Thank you.
Well, the 1930s was the crucible in which the later Chicago School of Friedman Stigler emerged. So what was that school and where were its roots in the 1930s located? Well, some hints come from an address Friedman gave to the Board of Trustees at the University in 1974 called Schools at Chicago, where Friedman argued that Chicago was distinctive, both in terms of economics and in terms of economic policy. So in terms of economics, Friedman said the distinctive approach is rigorous use of theory applied to real-world problems and subjecting that theory to empirical tests. And when one goes back to the 1930s, one thinks of Viner, of course, for the theory, but also Paul Douglas and Henry Schultz for the testing of those theories. He also said there was a distinctive approach with regard to economic policy. And there Friedman said that there was a belief in the efficacy of markets as a way of allocating resources, a skepticism of government interference in economic matters, and finally the idea that inflation was due to monetary policy. So when we go back and think, well, what economist in the 1930s was responsible for that set of economic policy views, I think that Henry Simon stands out. I think he's had a lasting influence on Chicago policy views, even though many of his specific policy recommendations have been questioned or even rejected by his successors. Now, Simon was not the most intellectually distinguished of the Chicago economists of this period. He wasn't the most famous of the Chicago economists during this period. Here's a Google Ngram that just indicates citation in books to the three economists we're talking about in this session, Viner, Knight, and Simons. And you can see that Viner in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s far outstripped Knight and Simons in terms of citations. Simon sort of matches Knight during certain periods in the 1950s. And it's very interesting to see how Knight has had staying power. But once again, Simons is at least a distant third here in terms of just fame and academic success and notoriety during this period. In fact, many of you know or have heard that he was fired by the economics department in 1934, along with Aaron Director, and he was saved by someone higher up in the administration, either President Hutchins or Dean Rummel or someone like that, and then he continued to stay on. But of course, this is citation, and there's a difference between being cited and having influence. And I think that far more than Viner or even Knight, Simons had an influence on the policy views of later economists coming from Chicago, and indeed helped shape the research agendas of Friedman, Stigler, and even others such as Greg Lewis. So there is a good authority for this statement of influence coming from Simons, and that is George Stigler, who called Simons the crown prince of that hypothetical kingdom, the Chicago School of Economics. Well, what was Simons famous for? I'd point to two things that came out in the mid-1930s. First of all, probably most famous for his 1934 pamphlet, A Positive Program for Laissez-Faire, some proposals for a liberal economic policy. And then 2 years later in the JPE, he had his famous Rules versus Authorities in Monetary Policy. These two works sort of lay out, make a major contribution to economic policy understanding during this period, and I think they've had an influence, as I'll suggest. I want to focus a little bit more on the Positive Program for Laissez-Faire, because that is where he sort of lays out a lot of his views, even though they would change a little bit later on. It's a good statement of his philosophy and his policy conclusions from that. So the Positive Program is divided into two parts. The first part sort of lays out his philosophy of economics broadly construed. And what he fundamentally believed was that competitive markets were absolutely critical, not just to efficient resource allocation, but to preserve economic and political freedom more broadly. And of course, it's that preserving economic and political freedom more broadly that Friedman, Stigler, and others bought into and helped extend. Now, of course, the specific means by which political and economic freedom could be preserved was hotly debated. That as a policy goal is something that Simon states right up front. So in terms of what were the specific policy recommendations that Simons made in the Positive Program? So he actually makes 5. And I'm going to start from the bottom up, and we'll sort of take it from there, because it's from sort of least importance to most importance. And the first 2 I really think are the critical ones. So the last one is he wanted to limit advertising, number 5. There's a common view at the time that, which obviously has not been accepted since for reasons I'll mention in a moment, but there's this view that advertising is wasteful expenditures, that it raises barriers to entry to new firms because they have to compete on this dimension as well. And of course, Stigler, with his economics of information, said, well, actually advertising is information provision to consumers. It's not something designed to limit or detract from competition. So that one obviously is not stuck here at the University of Chicago. Number 4, free trade. This is not a unique Chicago policy position at this time. One can find many other universities where most of the economists would be in favor of freer trade. Now, one might have thought that Viner, being the leading international economist here, would be the one out there pounding the table for freer trade, but turns out not the case. As you know, he was very much a dedicated scholar and didn't want to take strong policy positions. In the early 1930s, it was actually Paul Douglas, who was much more outspoken in favor of freer trade. He was the one who co-sponsored the AEA petition of over 1,000 economists, writing a letter to President Hoover protesting the Smoot-Hawley tariff and urging President Hoover to veto that act. Later in the 40s, when trade policy was back on the agenda as the U.S. was looking towards post-war trade policy, it was actually Simons who was writing much more than Viner on the importance of keeping trade open for the competitive price mechanism and what have you. But once again, that's not sort of a uniquely Chicago position. Number 3, tax policy to reduce inequality. So Simons had a very strong belief in economic equality. He never really exactly defined what he meant by that. But what's important here is not so much the objective that he's setting, but the means by which that objective should be achieved. He wanted to achieve it through progressive income taxes. That's not the way it was done at the day. It was done through a bunch of microeconomic regulations designed to change resource allocation in particular industries in a more fair way, but there wasn't this sort of this wholesale redistribution of income at the end of the day. And he absolutely abhorred this sort of micromanaging industries in terms of the prices they could charge, in terms of promoting public regulation to achieve a more equitable outcome, in terms of promoting unionization, setting caps on prices and things of that sort. He wanted to clear all that away and just have redistribution at the end of the day based on income. And once again, there's a historical context here. The federal government, only 10% of its income came from the income tax during this period. A lot was raised through excise taxes. And the tariff also raised some revenue for the government. And once again, those are things that Simons abhorred. He didn't want tariffs for revenue purposes. They interfered with the price mechanism. He didn't want excise taxes for exactly the same reason. He thought, A, they're regressive, B, they don't redistribute income in the right way, and they're relatively inefficient. They are interfering with prices. Don't interfere with the price mechanism, just tax income at the end of the day and redistribute it to achieve greater equality. Now, Chicago's not perhaps known for its great concerns about equality necessarily, or using progressive taxes to redistribute income, but one can find in Friedman and Stigler's later works still a concern about equality, even though one doesn't think about that as being first and foremost in their minds. For example, in Roofs and Ceilings, they actually got into trouble with the publisher for saying that greater equality of economic resources ought to be an objective of government policy. The publisher wanted to strike that out because they didn't agree with it, but they insisted that it be kept in. And even later in his life, Friedman made some strong statements in favor of greater equality, but once again, the way in which that should be achieved is through educational reform and increasing educational opportunity, not necessarily through other mechanisms. But it's really the first two that I think are important for Simon's legacy to Chicago economics, and they both have to be considered in tandem. It's the pairing of the two that I think is very important. First of all, promote competitive markets. And that doesn't necessarily mean free markets where the government has no policy whatsoever. It may have to take a proactive government policy to keep markets competitive. And second of all, achieve monetary stability through rules, that I'll mention in a moment. So you need a system, a framework to anchor monetary policy. Well, these were live issues of the day. These were not just sort of things that he had been concerned about. He was reflecting on what was going on in 1930s America. So on the left-hand side there, we see the price level. That's not the inflation rate, that's the price level going up and down. It's a yo-yo, bouncing around. Of course, the great contraction of prices in the early 1930s, followed by a rebound, then a slump in prices again, followed by a bout of inflation before the war, and then big inflation after the war, and of course World War I, major swings in the price level. This is what he's reacting to in saying that we need monetary stability. And then on the right-hand side, we see the NRA, something he and Knight were also reacting to, which is basically microeconomic regulation and the cartelization of markets and movement away from the competitive market system that he so dearly embraced. But what Simons is pointing out is there's a relationship between the two. You need both. If you have monetary instability, you cannot have competitive markets, because there'll be pressure put on the government to provide stability. If it can't do it through monetary mechanisms, then it'll do it through microeconomic regulation of particular industries. So you'll try to achieve stability in employment, stability in prices, stability in profits by having these codes where the government manages competition, limits competition, and detracts from competitive markets. If you had price stability or monetary stability, then you could allow competitive markets to work. So the price of monetary instability is greater government regulation in a way that detracts from competition and detracts from the efficiency properties of markets. You need both. And I think this is a very unique thing. So in fact, Friedman remarks in his comment on the critics in the early 70s saying that students at Chicago were not attracted to Keynes because they had the whole package right here. You need monetary stability and competitive markets. You could go to the London School of Economics, say, and they would stress the importance of competitive markets. But if you downplay monetary stability, then you're really not going to get competitive markets. You're only going to get half of it, and your students are going to say, why should I be worried about competitive markets when there's 25% unemployment? You could go to Yale and study with Irving Fisher, and he'll teach you all about the importance of monetary stability. But there's no vision of competitive markets as being an ideal that would help out both in terms of political and economic freedom. So at Chicago, you got this whole package. So then the question is, how do you achieve these two things, monetary stability and competitive markets. And so this is what Simon says. Competitive markets, once again, it requires a proactive policy. He was very suspicious of concentrated power. He wanted decentralization. He was not a big fan of big corporations. He wanted aggressive antitrust policy. He wanted to go after price-fixing schemes and eliminate monopolies. He wanted to oppose government restrictions on competition and was very much worried that the government actually acted to restrict competition. And he was very skeptical of government regulation in terms of entry conditions, prices that they could charge, and things of that sort. Now here, Simon's got into a little bit of a problem because in one paragraph, maybe two, of the positive program, he made a statement such, basically along the lines that, well, if conditions of effective competition cannot be met in industries such as railroads, natural monopolies, then we might want to consider, public takeover, a public monopoly, socialization of those particular industries. And he was beaten up at the time, one of his first correspondence with Friedrich Hayek. Hayek sort of raises his eyebrows about this, saying, public monopolies didn't work out so well here. Why would you advocate that? I would dissent from that. And most of the people, at least in the front of the audience here, will remember or know of the 1983 Journal of Law and Economics roundtable, the Fire of Truth, where basically Coase and others begin to beat up on Simons a bit for saying, wow, he was really interventionist. He wanted, socialization of industry. Well, in his defense, first of all, he did backtrack a little bit from that in an AER publication published about 2 years later, where he refers to a London economist, meaning Hayek, who had criticized his views. But even in the positive program, what was worst, the worst possible outcome in Simon's mind, was public regulation. He called it a malignant cancer, because if you get public regulation in one industry, it's going to spread to others, because it's going to create byproduct distortions. And so that was the worst of all possible worlds. Then the only choice is between private monopoly, which he called a tolerable evil, versus public monopoly, meaning socialization. He was proposing socialization as an experiment, but he didn't necessarily rank order it as being a good thing in and of itself. In fact, what you find in Simon's work time and time again is he's just spinning off ideas, and he's not necessarily deeply committed to any one particular policy proposal. It's the outcomes that he cares about, and he's willing to experiment and debate on exactly how you achieve that. And I would put his statement about public socialization in that context. He also, of course, talked about the importance of monetary stability, and the way to achieve that, of course, was through the Chicago Plan, 100% money, and a price level rule. Okay, avoid that yo-yo of prices up and down. He called central bank policy insane prior to 1934, precisely because the price level was being buffeted up and down. But the main point here is, once again, the combination of the two. If you can assure economic stability through sound monetary policy, then the competitive market system will work well. And you won't create these pressures for government regulation to compensate for the fact that you have monetary instability. You still need a proactive policy with regard to markets, but it will generally work well. So this point is coming out of the events of the 1930s. It's a reflection of what he was seeing, both in terms of monetary policy and the NRA and other New Deal policies in the 1930s. But the message, I think, resonates well beyond the 1930s. Here, I think you can see the origins of Friedman and Stigler's research agendas. Here you can see the questions that they're trying to pose and answer throughout their careers. Now, once again, Simons is proposing these as questions. They don't necessarily buy into the answers he's going to give, but the questions were ones that they grappled with throughout their career. So here's Milton Friedman giving the 1967 Simons Lecture at the law school here, and of course the title of Monetary Theory and Policy of Henry Simons, and he talks about the influence of Simons on his work. And of course, Friedman was devoted a great part of his career to understanding the conditions for monetary stability and how to achieve that. Friedman endorsed 100% money, certainly endorsed the idea of monetary stability. He dissented from Simons in terms of the means by which to achieve that objective. So Simons said we need a price level target. Friedman said, no, we have to back it out in terms of what the central bank can actually control, which is the quantity of money. And so he wanted a quantity of money standard, not a price level target. But we have a whole session this afternoon on monetary policy and monetary economics, so I won't talk too much about that. Here's Stigler actually giving the first Simons lectured in 1958, also at the law school, on the goals of economic policy, where once again he's very much in line with what Simons is saying. But when you think about Stigler's research agenda, this is what he's going after. Some of his early questions were the extent and basis of monopoly, his 1942 AER paper, tried to quantify how competitive are markets. Is monopoly a pervasive phenomenon? What can we possibly do to limit the impact of monopoly on society? And Stigler comes to the conclusion that the major factor in the decline of competition has been governmental support of monopoly. But once again, that's something that Simons had highlighted earlier, and Stigler's sort of fleshing that out to a greater extent. Sort of a forgotten paper of Stigler's in Fortune magazine, The Case Against Big Business. Once again, a very Simon-esque theme about the problems of concentrated power, not just for economic reasons, but for political reasons as well. Stigler didn't refer back to this very much, but once again, this is early on in his career, very much reflecting of a concern of Simons. Stigler always favored the Sherman Antitrust Act, restrictions on mergers to prevent collusion and the cartelization of markets. And just like Simons had said, Stigler began to probe and question the benefits of public regulation, which Simons had just very much dismissed as being, as I said, this malignant cancer. Stigler was saying, well, let's actually examine this in a scientific way. Does it yield any benefits in terms of better prices for consumers or what have you? Now, once again, there is a historical context to all these writers and what they're concerned about and the policy conclusions that they draw. So the 1930s was a very different environment than the 1950s and 60s. In the 1930s, monetary instability, cartelization of markets through the NRA. In the 1950s and 60s, much greater monetary stability and more competitive markets. And so that's why when you read the Stigler conclusion from 1961, he says, I'm actually not very concerned about the market power held by labor unions or big business. The amount of power they possessed is usually very small, so that even in the worst case, they'll do only modest damage to the community. That's not a repudiation of Simons. That's just saying the world's changed, we're in a different world. I'm still concerned about these things, but we're not exactly in the world of the 1930s. So once again, the questions posed by Simons are ones that are taken up by later generations. Those questions are enduring, even if the answers, specific answers given, are quite different. And here are those different answers, both Friedman and Stigler. Friedman said he found his monetary theory sophisticated and modern, but his policy recommendations unacceptable. Once again, different era. And Stigler said he's no longer a faithful follower, although still an admirer of Frank Knight and Henry Simons. Once again, the philosophical framework and the questions that they were posing, things that they took in terms of their research agendas later on. So Simons, in some sense, embodies both Mr. Micro and Mr. Macro. He said the two are related. We need to worry about monetary stability. We need to worry about competitive markets. And his two students, indirectly his students, went on and carried that tradition, one focusing mainly on the monetary side, the other mainly focusing on the importance of competitive markets. So I'll leave it there.